it wasn't right. He said, you just take this stuff and get on out of this office and don't come back, you're laid off. I said, fine, I will get even with you. And I left. Started getting angry with myself because I could not go out there and work. So I just walked in and I yelled, hey, I want to talk to you. You're not just going to blow me off like a piece of trash or something. We're going to talk. And the next thing you know, there's a shotgun there. It goes off, and he dropped to the floor dead.
We live in a violent culture, and unfortunately, it is an increasingly violent culture. For the violence that we found in the streets has now opened the door and walked through into the workplace.
For women, the #1 cause of death in the workplace is homicide. For men, the #2 cause for death in the workplace is workplace homicide. For every single one of these situations, there's an untold cost, and that is the psychological trauma that comes with not only an incident of workplace violence, but the threat of workplace violence. We need within the employer's environment to change our sensitivities toward the whole issue of workplace violence and threats of violence, and much like with the field of sexual harassment, establish a standard that it's not okay to tolerate or to make indirect or direct threats of violence.
We know now that there are two types of workplace violence. First is in which the individual is making threats of violence and actually intends to carry out that physical harm. The second is where the person is making threats of physical violence, but really intends to generate intimidation, fear, and emotional distress in coworkers.
It can be destruction of property. It can be a matter of tampering with a computer. It can be a matter of stalking, of phone calls, of infliction of emotional distress.
Learning about workplace violence and being able to manage it means that we have to understand that there are, in fact, common themes and common events which appear over and over again.
And whenever that's diagnosed, then that starts suggesting that there's something we can do to better predict early indications of a problem, and in turn, policies and steps that a company can take in making a difference.
In the situation we're about to see, some of those common themes and events will be illustrated. But we need to understand that each situation has its unique characteristics and needs to be evaluated on its own merits.
Word has come down. Starting tomorrow, we're going to get a lot more attention from quality control.
Oh, yeah, that's exactly what we...
Oh, that's great. That's so...
Hey, I know it's a pain, but component failure has gone up for the last 3 months in a row, and something is wrong someplace.
I tell you what's wrong. This is what's wrong. Man, you can't keep this up.
Okay, look, here's the deal. A random sampling of your work is going to be reviewed in detail by QC. Some of your work will probably be kicked back more than usual. So
That is not quality control. That is spying. It's not right.
You both are going to be looking for another job.
Yeah, I'm going to be running the...
okay, are there any questions, real questions? Anybody? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Back to work, please.
Okay, all right.
It's been nice.
Hey, Carl, you got a minute?
Yeah.
The individuals that we see involved in workplace violence are rarely new to the organization, nor do we generally find them at the very lower levels of the organization.
Generally, the person is a loner. They have a little bit of trouble or a lot of trouble relating to other people in the work environment. And don't be misled. Sometimes these people are very bright. Sometimes they're very articulate. But nonetheless, they very much tend to have their own isolation and distance, and that's usually felt by co-employees, usually felt very much by the immediate supervisor, the frontline manager.
Some people can maintain easier than other people can, no matter what the circumstances are. And others, they have no tolerance. On the surface, they look like a real mellow and easygoing person, but they have no tolerance.
A common myth is the idea that violence just happens, that someone snaps, and all of a sudden you have a normal employee, and the next day they bring in a semi-automatic weapon and shoot someone. Well, this rarely is the circumstance.
Have a seat. I just want to talk to you. I just want to make sure you're okay with this. You seemed a little bit concerned to me.
Yeah, I was a little concerned. Because it's wrong. I know right, I know wrong. This is definitely wrong. And I think I got this thing figured out.
Okay, well, what is it, Carl?
I do good work.
You do good work.
I do good work, and they put on more pressure. It doesn't make sense. It's like they want to make people crack.
Wait a minute, Carl.
Furthermore, I think I know who's behind it.
Really?
The new guy, Brubaker, and that loudmouth in production.
You know what I think, Carl? I think you're blowing it way out of proportion. I really do.
They keep it up. Something's gonna happen.
You know what, Carl? I need your cooperation. Why don't you give me a few days, and we'll see.
Come on, this is not about a few days. This is about pushing people. Pushing people too hard. People have their limits.
They feel there's something that they're entitled to that the organization owes them. It may not be something that you or I would understand, but for them it's a deeply held belief.
And that brings us down to kind of a core fundamental, and that is this sense of moral righteousness, a feeling that people have done them wrong.
When a person is this concerned with what's happening to them, it becomes difficult for them to perform their job. And so quite often you'll see a decline in productivity. They're having greater difficulties getting along with their coworkers. They have difficulty understanding instructions and supervision.
What's up?
Nothing's up. F3R, enter.
Here, let me see.
I said it's... Why is... This new keystroke is stupid. Whose idea was this?
It's just the new system.
It's not just a new system, it's another hoop. This is crap.
It's software, Carl.
Damn, this is not fair. God. It's Robinson, Brubaker, Montgomery.
John.
Oh, you don't think they're all in on it? Phew. Wake up. You think we're all asleep.
What we will often see is somebody who has worked with a company for a fairly long time, and they've had a degree of success. They've had some very good performance evaluations in the past, but often their performance starts to ebb and problems start setting in, and they may be well going through a performance evaluation where there are some questions starting to generate.
This company is in a lot of trouble, and nobody's doing anything about it.
John Montgomery was Carl's supervisor, and I was John's supervisor. Carl's reviews had been mostly satisfactory for the first several years he was with the company, but then he started to slip. John was concerned, so when Carl came up for review again, he asked me to sit in.
Which is exactly what they want you to do.
Wait, who is they?
I'm not the problem. Robinson's the problem. Brubaker's the problem. They're They're obsessed with these quarterly numbers.
Well, that's their job.
Yeah, well, you can't keep treating people like they're
Carl,
numbers.
maybe we can come back to that. But for the moment, let's look at your performance. That's why we're here, to discuss that.
If this company doesn't change,
Where with a regular employee, you might call them in your office and criticize them with regard to performance on a particular project or constructively give them help. With someone who's giving off these very strong signals, anger, hostility, fear, potentially direct or indirect threats, there is a tendency to put distance, even on the part of the immediate supervisor, from that individual, and a tendency to treat them differently than other employees, rather than applying discipline in a consistent and fair manner.
You want to tell me where to look this one up in the handbook?
What about his coworkers? Has anybody said anything?
No, not really. I mean, they go their way and he goes his. It's not like it's a case of sexual harassment or like he slugged somebody. I mean, the guy is just, he's wound too tight. You know, what's the policy on that?
Yeah, but this stuff about Robinson and Brubaker, I mean, what was that?
I don't know. That was the first I'd heard about it, but he's right. Robinson is a pinhead.
Okay. But on the other hand, we are Carl's third department. I mean, maybe the guy has a little problem fitting in.
Hey, look, you know, it's not a popularity contest. I mean, the guy does a good job. I don't know. He's not a happy camper.
Okay, so we both write an evaluation, and you're going to keep me informed, right?
Yeah.
You're sure you're comfortable with this? We could go to Human Resources and see if they have any ideas.
No. No, I can handle it, really.
Okay.
There is an underappreciation of the importance of that evaluation process and what goes into the evaluation. In fact, there's a fundamental tendency to pull away, soften the evaluation, and avoid confrontation. And the thought is that if I do this, I won't antagonize the individual. It'll keep things under control. Ironically, this is fundamentally wrong and actually encourages the problem and makes it worse.
Things happen out there in society that, just like in here, things happen. Some things can be controlled. Some things can be spotted before it happens.
There are several early warning signs with regard to workplace violence. Right at the top of the list is direct or indirect threats of violence. These threats don't just get made to one individual, but get made to several individuals, and they have to be recognized. Another example would be a fascination for incidents of workplace violence. It's a sympathy for the perpetrator and a focusing and a fascination on the event that really should raise alarm.
This can also manifest itself in terms of a fascination with firearms. Not just firearms per se, but the use of automatic weapons.
Their killing power, their ability to instill fear in individuals, and often bringing that information and even the literature into the work environment.
This guy went into his job and shot some of his co-workers. Listen to this. Police believe the attack lasted less than 3 minutes. Nevertheless, they estimate...
And he got how many people?
3 dead and 2 wounded.
And then don't tell me, he turned the gun on himself. Am I right?
Of course.
what do you use?
Let me see.
You had to have multiple weapons.
Oh, no. You see, you should have never mentioned guns to Carl. There he goes. He's gonna be here all day.
Yeah. Guy knew what he had to do. He used an assault rifle.
Carl, this guy killed 3 people.
An employee at the company for over 6 years.
Yeah?
You can't throw people away like that.
Oh, man.
They push and they push and they push, and then finally somebody pushes back.
Oh, Carl.
Come on now.
You know how I do it?
How would you do it? You're such a kidder. Go ahead, please tell us how you would do this.
I would first take out Brubaker. Then I get down the hall to Robinson. I come back. I'll come back from Montgomery. And they'd be at their little desk dreaming up more stuff for me to do. I would just knock. Payday.
If someone begins to make a comment about feeling so personally injured that they might consider taking someone else's life, that's not a comment that any of us want to hear.
And these statements remarkably don't get registered. They don't get reported back to management so that we can do something about it.
It was wrong all the way around on both sides. That was wrong. Me for losing my temper and not trying to get things worked out. On the other hand, them for lying to me the way they did and then using me the way they did and then just discard me off to the side of the road like someone dumping a puppy off on the side of the road.
When an organization realizes that in fact they are faced with a legitimate threat, or at least a threat that is clearly designed to create distress and fear and intimidation in other people, often the first normal reaction is, what can we do to remove this person from our organization? And the list of alternatives and options gets read.
And unfortunately, sometimes we've seen the layoff process misused.
Got a minute?
Sure, Susan. Come on in. Hey, what's going on?
I think we've got a solution to the Carl problem.
Oh, really?
They're restructuring again.
Okay.
We're being placed under manufacturing, and we have to lose 3 slots. We lose the position, lose the problem. Sorry, Carl. Nothing we can do about it.
What about human resources?
Well, it's not a dismissal for poor performance, it's a straight reorg.
Okay, sure.
So when they look at it, I don't think they'll have a problem with it.
We've just witnessed an effort to deal with the situation without addressing the real problem. Management in dealing with this kind of problem needs to specifically deal with it. That means identifying it for what it is, taking appropriate disciplinary action, and notifying the resources within the company as to the problem that they have. If you don't do that, you can't deal with the problem, and the danger is there that it can come back and erupt.
I will live with this for the rest of my life. We all will.
Carl.
How do you measure the cost? In terms of pain and productivity?
You've already been to human resources.
Oh, yeah. I've already been laid off.
Well, look, if it's any consolation, I'm sorry. It's just the way the numbers came down, and, well, you know.
No, I know how it works. You won't get away with it. None of you.
Wait a minute, Carl.
You don't throw people away like this. It's not how it works. You think this is over, huh? Let me tell you something. I'm not leaving alone. You got that?
If you've got a man that's breaking his back to do his best for the company and you feel something's not right, sit down with him and talk about it. You know, get it out in the open. If it's a problem at home that's interfering with his work, talk with him. Try to help him with it. Don't let him keep it bottled up, because usually that's when they end up getting fired and things happening.
In talking and interviewing with people who have committed acts of workplace homicide and violence, they tell us some very interesting things. And one of the most important of those things is that as they begin to do these behaviors that we're telling people, providing clues that something was going to happen, no one intervened, no one asked, what does this mean? What is this all about?
And indeed, if we could intervene at an early stage with regard to Carl, for example, and expose him to an employee assistance program to tell him that that kind of conduct just is not acceptable here, there's a good chance we will make a difference, that it will redirect his energies and, in fact, stop this escalation from occurring.
It would have made a big difference. They would still be alive. I wouldn't be in here.
There are steps that are legally available to a supervisor, to a group leader, or to an employer that can cause an intervention at an early stage. There is something you can do about it, and these steps generally are permissible under current legal standards, but they require the ability to identify specific behavior, document the behavior, and then be able to use correctly and consistently a policy with regard to workplace violence. And the supervisor that can document what occurred, write it down in a way that says it occurred at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. These are the people that were present. This is what occurred. It's only when you report it that the employer is going to be in a position to do something about it. When John experienced this event, he obviously felt fear. Ideally, what John would have done at that point is recognized he may have a potential problem on his hands, and that he in turn would have documented the event and then started to determine whether it should be reported and what additional resources should be used. At a bare minimum, this is clear and unequivocal justification for a monitoring process on the part of John of future conduct with regard to Carl. It's a wake-up call. Let's look at how some of these situations could have been handled more appropriately.
I don't think I got a little too close. I don't know, there's something about Carl that I just find a little intimidating.
John, you've been around for a while. You've dealt with a lot of people. If this guy's sending off an alarm for you, that's enough for me.
Well, you know, he's got a review coming up, and to be quite honest, I don't know how to handle it.
You know what? Let's take it to Human Resources. Never hurts to get things on the record. And anyway, they might have some ideas for handling Carl's review.
One of the most important organizational components in responding to workplace violence is the Human Resources Department. They have the ability to be able to carefully review the background of the individual, if necessary, to be able to re-interview current employees to establish exactly what was said and by whom.
Depending upon the evaluation of how serious the situation is at that stage, we can expect that John might be counseled simply to go back and talk with Carl further. Second step would be to talk to John again and to find out if there are things that John really observed but didn't recognize as important. A third step would be talking with co-employees and finding out if they're having some experiences or reactions and document those events as part of this process.
So we did some research, and it seems that Carl has a bit of a history.
History?
Seems he likes to intimidate people. It was the reason behind at least one of his transfers.
Really? You know, the rest of the crew pretty much just leaves him alone, but I wonder if that isn't because they're afraid of him.
Our research has shown that the overwhelming majority of individuals that later on engage in workplace violence, serious violence, homicide, do not have a criminal record. But often they will have a record of having, even within that same employment, engaged in workplace violence or at a prior job. All too often, when an employee, especially a co-worker, receives a threat, they do not respond to it. And part of this can be directly attributed to the atmosphere that's present and a feeling on the part of the person receiving the threat that, well, if I report it, nothing will be done about it. It probably isn't going to lead to anything. It's going to get me and maybe Carl in a lot of trouble. Yet, even with that, there'll be a certain degree of residual fear that Jimmy is going to experience.
Hey, John, you got a minute? Hey,
and
Jimmy.
it's so vital in these circumstances to have an atmosphere present within the company that says if you get a threat of violence in the workplace, please report it, we'll investigate it, and we will take action.
Me and Diane, we were in the break room with Carl.
And then an openness or willingness on the part of the supervisor to listen to the problem.
He was saying some pretty strange stuff.
Tell me about it. What kind of strange stuff was he talking about?
He's got it out for you and Brubaker and Robinson like.
The first step very likely to occur through the Human Resources Department or the security personnel would be to verify what was said. Second step would be to determine whether there's anybody else that heard the threat so that effectively you can validate that it did occur. The decision would then be made whether to immediately interview Carl. It may even mean bringing in an outside person, a psychologist, for example, that will participate in the interview process for the purpose of determining what type of immediate threat is present and how the company should respond to it.
It's now management's responsibility to draw together a team approach in order to understand and assess the problem and develop a proper response. Effective team management involves a series of different people: representation from line management, from human resources, from professional security or organizational security, and also from the behavioral sciences, from a psychologist or psychiatrist specially trained in the assessment of violent individuals.
All of this collectively would very likely result in a decision to take some type of disciplinary action. It could well be a termination. Of course, before an appropriate response can be determined that is consistent with company policy, a matrix of legal and security issues must be resolved. The resulting decision may be a combination of discipline and counseling, suspension, or termination. One of the interesting reactions that you will often get is a feeling that if you terminate Carl at this stage, it's worse, that he's going to explode and respond to that situation by actually engaging in violence. This common feeling is almost always wrong, that we find that if you intervene firmly at that stage, there's a greater tendency that you will actually get the person to look back at what they're doing and telling them this is not okay, and that the company, the employer, is going to take all the steps necessary to protect the workplace and also to make certain that its rules and regulations are properly covered. Even after termination, there are vital steps that an organization can take. Encourage the reporting of threatening statements or behavior during the termination process. Convene the management team and make a threat assessment. This may require the use of professional assistance. Notify threatened personnel. Consider legal options, including injunctive relief. And develop a short-term and long-term security plan, preferably in cooperation with local law enforcement.
If I could just stop one person from making that mistake, this is not a life to want to live.
There's a real need for an internalization of the issue at all levels within the company, and taking it seriously, that when a threat is made, that can have a tremendous impact on an employee's life. And it's your responsibility to be sensitive to that. Take it seriously and observe where it came from, what the circumstances were, and translate it into the ability of the company to do something about it. And there are 3 fundamental steps that make a difference. Number 1, be aware of the problem of workplace violence. Understand it as a significant concern that requires a priority and an attention in the workplace. Number 2, when early warning signals occur, document what has occurred so that you effectively unlock the ability of the employer to use some of the tools that are available in addressing problem situations. And finally, there's a need to follow and enforce a company policy that effectively sends the message that in the workplace, this type of conduct is not acceptable. But all of this is conditioned upon your ability to recognize the problem, not ignore it, and take action.